Hello, how's everybody doing? Wednesday evening, 9 p.m. in beautiful Smithtown at the palatial home of the Menzers. This lecture will be for tomorrow. This is New Deal Day 4, and this is our last New Deal Day. Friday, we are taking a chill day, and Monday, we are going to air the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, which is going to push us into the World War II side of this unit. So, what I'm planning on doing is setting up either Zoom meetings or Google Meets with each class. So A period, E period, G period, and we're going to put aside an hour, and it's about a half hour video, and then we will talk about it and check in and see how everybody's doing and feeling and all that good stuff. All right, so that is the plan. Possibly a test next Friday. If not, it'll be the following Monday because I got to figure out how many days I need to do World War II. All right. So let's get back. We're New Deal. We're around 1935, 1936. FDR is nearing the end of his first term. Now, FDR, like so many other effective presidents, was a great communicator. Okay. Knew how to talk to people of all different stripes, all different socioeconomic levels. And remember, I mean, he's born with a silver spoon, super, super wealthy, but was still able to relate, tell stories, tell anecdotes, really connect with people, show them that he cared. So he is similar to Roosevelt in that people love Teddy Roosevelt in terms of people loving him. Teddy Roosevelt was a bit more big and brash and bold. FDR was a little more smooth and casual in terms of their style. You could probably equate FDR more to a Lincoln in the sense of very calm, people screaming around him, but he remained calm. All right. Now, we talked about the radio changing the culture in the 1920s, the social culture for the most part, economic a bit in terms of the branding and the advertising, but we didn't talk too much about the radio's role in politics. FDR is going to be the first one to start to use the radio as a form of mass communication to be able to get his message out to other people. And it's kind of interesting because reading a newspaper is, unless the president wrote the article himself, and even then you would have to be certain that it wasn't edited or altered in any way, it's a secondhand account of what somebody said. So the radio was a firsthand primary source, right from the horse's mouth kind of technology that is going to increasingly be in more and more Americans' living rooms. And this is what people are going to bond over, like just like the TV is going to become that in the 1950s. People sat around the radio, listened to music, danced, listened to sports, listened to opera, theater, whatever. And now they're here listening to politics. So he is doing this to basically comfort the American people. Remember, there's a lot of problems out there with this Great Depression. There's a lot of depression. There's a lot of suicide. There's a lot of lack of future, lack of destiny, lack of hope. So he is going to kind of sit in the armchair and be pastoral to the people of America and try to raise their spirits and give them some sort of hope and confidence that things might get better. So let's listen quickly to one of his fireside chats.
My most immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress. Its first objective is to put men and women now on the relief rolls to work, and incidentally to assist materially in our already unmistakable march towards recovery. For the first time in 5 long years, the relief rolls have declined instead of increased during the winter months, and they are still declining. In spite of these facts, however, unemployment remains a serious problem here as in every other nation, and it is because of this that we've come to recognize the possibility and the necessity of certain helpful remedial measures. These measures are of two kinds. The first is to make provisions intended to relieve, to minimize, and to prevent future unemployment. The second is to establish measures, the practical means to help those who are unemployed in the present emergency. Our Social Security legislation is an attempt to answer the first of these questions, and our work relief program the second. We're losing no time in getting the government's vast work relief program underway, and we have every reason to believe that it should be in full swing by the autumn.
Okay, so that just gives you a little bit of a flavor of what he sounded like, what one of his fireside chats, what the topics were, what he was discussing with the people. And he's going to do this pretty regularly to communicate and to form a connection. It's a different form of intimacy if you think about it, that a president for the first time communicates like conversationally with the people. And it is very, fatherly, pastoral, whatever word you want to use, especially in a trying time, in a crisis like what was going on there in the 1930s. Now, let's talk about the word liberal. It has had different meanings over time. So classically liberal is not what you think of today as a liberal, all right? A classic liberal would be today's libertarian. So limited government, free market, laissez-faire economics, hands off. So FDR is going to remove the classical connotation from the word liberal, and he is going to redefine the word, calling it a large, active, socially conscious state. That this is what was needed to help the people. This is what that was needed to help bring some sort of wealth and class equality back to the country. And it has really been what the term liberal means today, right? A large, active, socially conscious state. I think you could define that as a liberal idea even by today's standards. It's a picture of FDR in one of his fireside chats. You see the different networks here. All right, now the election of 1936. So the first term for FDR is in the books. Pretty good. Is slowly turning some things around, is putting some people back to work, getting an enormous challenge from the Supreme Court as we discussed yesterday, so that's going to remain a problem. Now, the ideal of freedom becomes a central issue, and we see stark divisions in this country between Democrats and Republicans during this election. Now, we have been defining the word freedom since the very first day of class, the different definitions of it, the different interpretations of it, depending on the decade and the time period. And it is, even today, what freedom is to one person, it means something different to somebody else. All right. Now, the Democrats are going to argue that democracy for opportunity for all people, and they are going to run against the Kansas governor, Alfred Landon, who denounces Social Security as a threat to individual liberty. So the Republicans are going to stand against Social Security, against welfare from the government in any form, okay, against the idea of the government becoming an employer for works progress and public works and civilian conservation corps and all of that stuff. They are still of the mind that this is going to poison the economy. People are going to get dependent, that they'll always get a job from the government, that they'll always get a check from the government, that they'll always have disability or unemployment, and it'll take the work ethic out of the country. Now, you hear that argument today, but it is much, much quieter. There is very few people that go after Social Security in this country. Unemployment, you hear, especially right now, you don't hear any criticism of unemployment. If anything, people are calling for more unemployment. But unemployment, I think in New York State, goes about 6 months and then they kick you off. So the idea that it's going to make you lazy, if it is, it's only going to be for 6 months or a year, and then you're going to have to get off and you're going to have to get a job and fend for yourself. I would imagine that food stamps is probably one of the most or more controversial pieces of welfare that is today. We'll get into that in the 1960s when Lyndon B. Johnson is going to create that as part of his Great Society programs. So FDR is going to win a landslide election. He wins every state except for Maine and Vermont, which is kind of interesting because Maine and Vermont pride themselves on being very, very individualistic states where, you think of the lonely man in the log cabin sitting, 100 miles from his nearest neighbor listening to nature. They don't need big government. Okay, big government means problems for them. They want small local government, weakest federal government possible. All right, but the fact that FDR is winning the southern states, is winning Pennsylvania, is winning New York, is winning, California, is winning all of these states from around the country, except for Maine and Vermont. That is a thrashing in that election. Now, the New Deal opposition is going to set the blueprint for future conservative movements aiming to deregulate business and dismantle welfare. And if you think about it, part 2 points of Republican talking points in almost every presidential senatorial election is the deregulation of business and the dismantling of welfare. So if you think of today's political struggle and the different points that the sides make against each other, we're starting to see this already in the election of 1936. Bigger, socially conscious government that helps more people versus deregulation of business, dismantle welfare. Deregulation of business allows businesses to make more money, supply side economics. Dismantle welfare is, you help people too much and people are going to get lazy and dependent on it. And that is socialism. That is not free market capitalism. Now, FDR, a broad coalition, organized labor, so workers, Southern whites. Remember, this is still it sounds like, it's interesting, right? FDR is a New York liberal. But the South, the racist Jim Crow South, is going to vote for him because the Republicans, if you remember from Reconstruction with Lincoln's party, they were very much anti the Republicans because the Republicans were bigger government to aid business. And somewhere, I guess, after the progressive age, you're going to start to see the difference where the Republicans become the party that is for business, that the Republicans are going to basically be against what Teddy Roosevelt stood for, that bigger government was okay at certain times in order to break up corporations and things like that. Republicans of the 1920s were very different after the progressive era. They were complete laissez-faire. Teddy Roosevelt and Taft were not laissez-faire. They were more hands-on and vigorous when it came to abuses by industrialists. So Northern blacks, Protestant farmers, Catholic and Jewish, ethnics, industrialized workers, and middle-class homeowners. I mean, that's just about everybody except for what? Extremely white, wealthy industrialists and, survivalist frontier people that kind of live on the fringes out in the more rural areas of the country. All right, now the court. What just happened? Where am I? I'm sorry. Court packing. All right. So he is emboldened by his election victory of 1936, and he is going to take a gigantic political risk. And this is incredibly unconstitutional what he is going to do. So, on the pretense or the idea that some Supreme Court justices are too old to function, he proposes that any judge staying on past the age of 7, he can appoint a new justice. 6 of the 9 of them were already 70 or older. Now, they put up a major roadblock against his New Deal. And this is, I guess, it's political shrewdness, I guess. It's the only way forward to try to be able to get your New Deal legislation moving again. So he picks on their age. And he says that because you're old, you're out of touch, you don't get it, you don't understand, and we need to get rid of you, basically. And once we do, if you're older than 70, you need to go, and he will appoint a new justice. Now, first of all, the president does not appoint justices, they nominate justices. And it was sort of a way for him to be able to force them into retirement so that the Constitution could be upheld where he would nominate one and the Congress would. Otherwise, he would appoint them directly. So the goal is to change the balance of power, and they are worried. I mean, the AAA already got struck down as unconstitutional. So did the National Recovery Act. The Democrats are worried that they're going to come after Social Security or the Wagner Act. Now, Social Security was a big piece of helping turn the country around, and the Wagner Act was about collective bargaining and giving them the right to form contracts with their industrialist leaders. So many are going to go crazy about this and say that FDR is an aspiring dictator. This is a major, major power grab. Congress is going to reject it smartly. Nobody's going to go for this, but the purpose is served. The justices see that a president that just won 48 states and has the broadest coalition that possibly America has ever seen in terms of the people that voted for him, they are going to do an about face on many of his key New Deal policies, and they are going to allow him more openness in forming these different pieces of legislation that is going to grow the government and spend the money and also potentially help people. So, beginning of 1937, the Supreme Court is going to uphold a minimum wage law in Washington, turned aside challenges against Social Security and the Wagner Act, upholds government's power to regulate wages, hours, child labor, and agricultural production. I mean, right there on this slide is a major, major shift in the country and a major shift in what the size of the government is going to be. If you think about it, from 1929 to 1945, okay, which is what? That is 16 years. There is going to be nothing but a growth of the federal government, first because of the Great Depression and then because of World War II. So if you look at our government today as big and bloated and the swamp and they spend a fortune, I mean, this is the beginning of it. Now, many would argue that they had to get bigger and more powerful, as they did during the Civil War. They had to here because of the Depression and because of the war. So we talked about Maynard Keynes back earlier in this unit. 1936, the economy is improving. FDR is going to reduce the federal farm subsidies and the WPA work relief, and it has disastrous results for the economy. It's like you thought it was better sooner than it was, so you scaled back some of these measures, and unemployment is going to kick back up again, going from 14 to 20%. So in 1936, the general theory of employment, interest, and money is published by John Maynard Keynes, the British economist. Remember, he is the one that said that you could spend money to stimulate the economy during economic downturns. This book is going to be wildly popular and spread all around the world to major economies that are also suffering the same thing. So it becomes more common that the government would go into debt. It becomes more mainstream. It becomes more understood, let's say, by university professors that could then say, hey, this isn't such a bad thing. We'll get the money back when the economy improves. Okay? So he had been employing some of Keynes's ideas up until now, but the actual publishing of this landmark book is going to be what solidifies it as a mainstream idea that is, going to be used by other economies. By 1938, FDR follows the idea, fixes the immediate crisis. This is the birth of Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics is very central in our economy today. The manipulation of the economy and the money supply by the federal government and the Federal Reserve, that was Keynes's idea. If you study economics in college, you probably read this book, but you will absolutely be learning about Keynes. And his nemesis was Friedrich Hayek, who was of the Austrian School of Economics. He was laissez-faire. He said that every time the government touched the money supply, it would lead to inflation, which would then lead eventually to unemployment and mass problems in society. He was a complete hands-off, laissez-faire economist. This is a picture of John Maynard Keynes right here. All right, so the New Deal and American women, and we've been tracking women since the beginning. Each decade, they've taken a step, okay? 1920, they get the right to vote. 1920s, we have the flappers and sexual liberation of women, mostly in cities. That is going to increase in the 1930s, oftentimes spearheaded by the president's wife, Eleanor. So the New Deal brought more women into government. FDR looked at his wife as super competent and able to serve alongside him in a political role. So if it was okay for her to have a say in the matters of the administration, then it was okay for other women to be working for the federal government. That's a major step forward for them because there's going to be more publicity. There's going to be more accolade and integrity in what it is that they can bring to the economy. Now, she's going to redefine the role of the First Lady. If you think of the First Lady today and what they do, the fact that they campaign, that they go on the road, that they have a cause, that they reach out to people, that they have this sort of maternal effect on the country, Eleanor Roosevelt is going to be the first very public First Lady like we have today. So she's going to travel all over, giving speeches, wrote a regular newspaper column, sometimes even disagreeing with her husband. Let's check this out.
During her husband's first year as president, Eleanor traveled more than 40,000 miles, reporting back to the White House on the New Deal.
Never before had a First Lady taken to the road and traveled hundreds of thousands of miles on her own, supporting her husband. What she was looking for was the human detail that she could bring back to her husband to let him understand what the people of his land were thinking, feeling, and hoping.
She became his legs. She became his emissary. She could go places that he couldn't go, and she went everywhere.
Eleanor wrote a daily column called My Day, held weekly press conferences, received hundreds of thousands of letters. Her popularity ratings were sometimes even higher than her husband's.
All right. So many women in the Great Depression were forced to leave work to make room for male jobs, so that's not a good thing. And male-headed households dominated social policy. No shock there. That's sort of standard operating procedure at that point. That is Eleanor. Now, the new conception of America, the New Deal, it's, the Democratic Party was the party of Southern Jim Crow segregation racism. So FDR is a breaking of the model of that. He was a Northern Democrat whose main points weren't necessarily about black people. They were about laissez-faire government, big business, the plight of the worker. So you're going to see them come together for these elections because life was bad in the North and the South because of the Depression. The problems of farmers were also the problems of city workers, which were also the problems of Northern blacks and Southern blacks. It was all sort of part of the same issue. So like a crisis can do, it can bring people together. And that's why you saw that big coalition and so many numbers in that landslide election. But understand something. FDR knows that he needs Southern support. He can't lose the Southerners to the Republican Party. Okay, he can't have them be free agents out there. He needs them on his side. So he has to make sure that he does just enough to keep black people in their place. Now, the New Deal does little for blacks. Local control of welfare and jobs limits black participation in the South. So, and even the Social Security at first was not given to black people. It was only for white citizens, okay? So if you give local control of the welfare and the jobs to the local state governments and the town and the county governments in the South, they'll control it and they'll give it to who they want. So in that way, FDR kind of skirted the issue and kind of got around it because he needed Southern Democratic support. All right. For the first time, prominent Catholics and Jews are going to hold positions inside FDR's cabinet and his administration. They are going to end prohibition with the 21st Amendment, with the Beer and Wine Revenue Act. Think about it. You take bootlegging out of the equation, where no tax is paid to the government, and you allow bars and restaurants to serve alcohol again. They're going to pay tax on that income, and that money is going to help the government, and it's also going to help businesses employ more people, and it also could push the crime rate down because organized crime wouldn't have that to sell. All right. Now, let's see. The mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, is elected in 1933. Immigrants are back on the rise, and I believe LaGuardia is the first Italian-American mayor, I don't know about in the country, but at least in New York. All right, two more. Now, the New Deal social change. This was the heyday of American communism. If you were a socialist or a communist at this time, you very much liked FDR's ideas. Now, moderate Democrats said he was going a little too far. FDR thought he was playing in the middle, and socialists said, you're not going far enough. You should be doing more. All right. So they had the more radical views of the New Dealers. They had widespread respect. They pushed for racial and religious equality and rights all over the nation. Everyone sharing in the suffering of the Great Depression brings races, religions, and ethnicities closer together. And we've talked about that all year. During times of crisis, your differences matter less than everybody else's. It's time to come under one purpose. Okay. So if the Great Depression was causing massive amounts of people to suffer, what does it matter if they're a different race or religion or ethnicity? They have the same problems. They need to find the solution together. Okay. More people are going to speak up for their civil liberties, their rights. Supreme Court changes its stance on economic issues and start to protect the civil liberties of people. So we're really going to have a giant movement to the left during this whole thing. Okay, 1920s was socially and culturally a bit left in cities, but predominantly right when it came to politics and Southern morality and things like that. This is going to be, the Depression is going to really, really change things because, like we said, when everybody shares a common problem, you put your differences aside, you realize that you're not that different after all. So that in and of itself kind of flies against conservatism and keeping things the way that it is. So the labor movement was central in promoting the civil liberties. Employers feel threatened, and in 1938, they're going to create the House is going to create an Un-American Activities Committee to investigate communist labor radicals. Dozens of federal employees are fired. Congress is going to pass the Smith Act, making it illegal to teach, advocate, or encourage the overthrow of the government. New York legislature's Rapp-Coder Committee investigates and fires 60 faculty members at New York City's public colleges for being communist. Now, this is the beginning of almost like the Cold War rhetoric that communism was the enemy of capitalism and of America. Remember, Russia's on the rise. They had the king murdered and his whole family when the Bolsheviks overthrew and took over. And communism is catching on in southern and eastern parts of Europe. The worker had taken it on the chin in the world, in the industrialized world, for many, many decades. So America wants to make sure that, yes, we need these somewhat socialist policies during this Great Depression, but when the economy goes back to being good, we want to get back to the business of free market capitalism. So that wax and wane between the capitalists and the socialists is going to, take root during this time period. And then eventually this is going to crescendo into McCarthyism in the 1950s and all the way through to the fall of the Berlin Wall, really. I mean, I remember growing up, I'm born in 1982. Within the first 10 years of my life, I can certainly remember there being anti-Russia, anti-communist rhetoric. Nothing crazy, but it just remember it. It still sticks out in my mind that there was that divide in the world. So this is going to kind of be the beginning of this. The country's headed left. So what do people on the right do? They dig their heels in to try to keep it back in the center and pull it back in their direction. So this attack on suspected communism is going to be the next couple of decades in this country. All right, end of the New Deal. 1938 midterm elections, conservative Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans start to push back against FDR and win some congressional seats back. It took 6 years. Typically when a president wins, like Obama won in 08, Republicans took back the House in 10. Trump won in 16, Democrats took back the House in 18. This took 6 years, not 2 or 4. Okay, so it shows you the gravity of the problem, that the politics really didn't, the division didn't really take hold yet because things were so bad out there. Okay, so this is going to help stall out some of the New Deal policies. And it also is a precursor. Some of those conservative Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans, those conservative Southern Democrats are going to eventually, within the next 10 or 15 years after this, are going to start to move to the Republican Party, and blacks are going to eventually start to move to the Democratic Party, which is where we see both of them today. Now, the accomplishments are immense, but it does not end the Great Depression. If you remember, we started at 25% unemployment. 8 years later, after term number 2, we are down to 15%. Is it better? Absolutely. Some of the other accomplishments: requiring employers to deal with unions. That is the Wagner Act. Insured bank deposits, the FDIC. Regulated the stock market, the SEC. Loaned money to homeowners, the FHA. Provided benefits to the elderly and the unemployed, the Social Security Act. And those are what each of those things did. All right. So is it better? Yes. Is it completely fixed? No. A full working productive economy is at 5%. So we still have another 10% to go to get there. Now, 1941, we're going to see Pearl Harbor. We're going to see our entrance into World War II. And then that number is going to go down significantly. So when we argue whether it was the New Deal or the war that ended the Great Depression, it is the war in terms of the numbers, because we lose 10% here, but 15% is still very, very unhealthy. So better, yes. Stop the bleeding, yes. But are we all the way back? No. I hope you guys are all doing well. I will post all this on Google Classroom and get you the Ed puzzle, and then I'll set up the times for us for Monday to screen Saving Private Ryan as a class. All right, guys, have a good night.